order to introduce our next guest, the esteemed Dr. Walter E. Williams, I want to begin by playing a clip of Dr. Williams back in 1984 for a free-to-choose network program special on race and poverty. This is cut 5. Let's take a listen. 1984.
1963, a time of incredible optimism for black people. The civil rights movement was about to achieve its greatest triumphs. A great war on poverty had been declared. But something went wrong. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This might be that road. It's covered thick with good intentions. In the mid-1960s and throughout the 70s and early 80s, federal and state governments poured immense energy and well over $1 trillion into the task of relieving poverty and promoting equality. The result, a complete failure. For many blacks at the lower end of the economic spectrum, the future looks more hopeless today than it did 20 years ago.
Now, since then, we've had welfare reform of the 1990s. Some things have changed, but there are a lot of things that have not changed. Dr. Walter E. Williams is the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He also is notably someone who filled in for Rush Limbaugh many, many times over the years. In fact, when I was in high school, I learned and got my first doses of free market economics talking with, well, not really talking with, but hearing Dr. Williams talk with us, listeners of the Rush Limbaugh Show, about free market economics. And I'm so pleased to welcome the author of Race and Economics, How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination, Professor Walter E. Williams, to Jimmy at the Crossroads on this Free to Choose Friday. Dr. Williams, can you hear me okay? Welcome to the show.
Yes, I can, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. It is always a pleasure, privilege, and honor to have you on, sir. Now, I played that clip from 1984. I'm sure you remember doing that documentary, which is on YouTube, by the way. Pretty darn phenomenal program at that time. Let me start there. I mean, you were talking about the road to hell being paved with good intentions and where things were at then, 1984. Now we're nearly 40 years later. What are you seeing here?
Well, I see a couple things. If you added up all the federal, state, and local government programs that have as their justification for fighting some aspect of poverty, it turns out that we've spent since the war on poverty during the Johnson administration, we spent over $22 trillion. Now, if you just gave that money to people who are defined as poor, they'd be rich. But I think that one of the things we have to recognize is that, material poverty is virtually non-existent in the United States. That is, poor Americans have what many middle-class people around the world do not have. That is, the average poor family, I think 65% of poor people are defined by the Census Department as poor. They own one car, and 17% own 2 or more cars. Poor people have cell phones, microwave ovens, air conditioning. Now, what there is, there is poverty, but it's poverty of the spirit. That is, people's values have changed. They many times they bought into the whole idea of dependency, and I think that this is it's a tragic consequence on the war on poverty. And then if you look at when I mentioned poverty of the spirit, is that people have lost their independence. They've adopted cultural forms of behavior that are devastating. And just one example of this is that today, roughly 30% of white babies are born out of wedlock, and close to 75% of black babies are born out of wedlock. Now, in 1940, or 1938 to be more precise, the numbers were 3% of illegitimacy rate among whites and slightly less than 11% among blacks. And so you say, well, what in the world has happened? And I think that the welfare state accounts for a lot of it.
I want to talk for a moment about your own personal background and play one more clip from that Free to Choose Network series in 1984, Cut 7, where you tell a little bit of a personal story growing up.
And where do people end up after the government denies them chances for a decent education or a decent job? In the clutches of the worst government roadblock of them all, the dependency of the welfare system. This is where we lived, the Richard Allen Project of North Philadelphia. My father deserted us when I was 3, so occasionally my mother had to take welfare. But she didn't like it, so she took work as a domestic servant whenever she could. Back then, welfare wasn't a way of life. My mother only received $25 a week. Almost any job paid more than that. So even if she wanted to stay on welfare, she had very little incentive to do so.
How would you assess, Dr. Williams, and I know you were touching on this, but where we're at today and what your life growing up can teach us about what needs to be done at this point in our history, especially during this pandemic and the economic crisis that we're facing?
Well, I think one of the things that was a part of, at least part of my life and part of everybody's life, many other people, is the whole idea that you had to somehow take care of yourself. You could not depend on other people. And now people have this idea of dependency. And keep in mind, to wind up not poor is not rocket science. There's essentially 4 things that you must do, and you will not wind up poor. Number 1 is to take a job, any kind of a job. Number 2, get married before you have children. Number 3, graduate from high school, and finally, stay out of the criminal justice system. If you do those combination of things, you're guaranteed not to be poor. That is, you're not guaranteed to be middle class or rich, but you will not be poor. That is, it turns out that a man and a wife working full time, even at a minimum wage job, their income is higher. Their combined income is higher than the Bureau of the Census poverty standard.
Dr. Walter E. Williams, our guest, again, professor of economics at George Mason University. One thing that we hear a lot, particularly from the left, is that blacks and other minorities are victims of capitalism and that the capitalist system is set up against them. However, your research and work you've done, for example, in your book, Race and Economics, How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination, and other writings and projects that you've worked on over many years, demonstrates something quite the opposite, I would say. Tell us about that.
Oh, yes. I think that, I'm sorry, that I think that a free market all over the world benefits those people who can be defined as not having much political clout. That is, for example, let's look at in the 1920s, a poor, illiterate Italian, if he wanted to get into the taxi cab business, he would just have to get a car and write the word taxi on it and maybe spend $20 for a license. Today, or at least up until recently, up until Uber and Lyft came in to compete with the taxi cab people, it was you had the average price for a medallion or license in New York was $700,000. Now, that effectively closes the market for a person who has ambition, who can get together money to buy a car and insurance, but that closes the market because he cannot afford $700,000 for a medallion or a license, or he either have the credit worthiness to be able to get a loan from the bank. And in my book, Race and Economics, How Much Can Be Explained by Discrimination, I give many examples of occupational licensing laws that cut off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. There's another aspect, a book I wrote a number of years ago, I think 1990 or 1989. It's called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And I spent a lot of time lecturing in South Africa, even during the apartheid regime. As a matter of fact, my first time in South Africa was in 1979, and I went there 4 or 5 more times. And I lectured at every university. But while I was lecturing at a black university, one of the students said, he's against capitalism, he's for communism. So I asked the student, do you think you ought to be able to work for whomever you please? And he said, yes, and apartheid laws prevent that. I said, do you think you ought to be able to live wherever you want to live? He said, yes. And I asked other similar questions, and I said, well, you're really for capitalism, but what has been making your lives difficult is socialism, and socialism is defined as government ownership and or government control over the means of production. And if you look all around the world, if you see the behavior of people, they're not running away from communism. I'm sorry, they're not running away from capitalism into communism. It's the exact reverse. That is, people in North Korea, they're running to South Korea if they can get a chance. During the Cold War, people are going from East Berlin to West Berlin. People are going from Cuba to the United States. You never see people running from the United States to Cuba or West Berlin to East Berlin or South Korea to North Korea. And just how people vote with their feet is a strong testament to the value of capitalism over socialism.
Dr. Walter E. Williams, our guest, once again, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads Free to Choose Friday. Let's talk about the minimum wage for a moment, because we see a big push for people across the country, and it's been expanding in terms of laws that have actually been passed in states and municipalities around the country. Here in Colorado, where I'm broadcasting from, for example, local governments are now able to set a minimum wage above the state's minimum wage, which is above the federal minimum wage. So there are a lot of people who think, oh, the minimum wage is a great way to help boost income to people, because it gives them an opportunity to access more money for their work, and so they can maybe have, ideally, a living wage if we pay them $15 an hour. Talk to us about what your research shows, Dr. Williams, of what the minimum wage actually does from both a economic level and then also a question of individual liberty, which I think is just as important, at least.
Yes, I think that if you look at the stated intentions behind the minimum wage, particularly in the United States, they're praiseworthy and laudable. As you said, people want to their poor fellow countrymen to be able to get higher wages, to have a higher standard of living. But when we look at laws, we cannot look at the intentions. We have to ask, what is the effect of such a law? What is the effect of minimum wages? Now, let's stick with the some of the states are advocating a $15 minimum wage. Well, let's look at that. Well, what is the effect of a $15 an hour minimum wage? Well, you see its effect by just putting yourself in the place of an employer, and you ask yourself, will I hire a person, pay him $15 an hour, when that person is so unfortunate so as to have skills that will enable him to only produce $5 worth of value per hour? That is, pay him $15, but he can only produce $5 worth of value. Well, most employers will look at that as a losing economic proposition. And so the first initial impact of the minimum wage is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled people. Well, in our labor force, who are the low-skilled people? Well, low-skilled people, for the most part, are teenagers. And the reason why they're low-skilled is because they lack the experience and maturity of adults. And then sharing those attributes are black teenagers. They not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of going to rotten schools, maybe living in broken families and poor neighborhoods. And so the effect of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled people and particularly black people. And if you look at the unemployment statistics down through the years, as I've done, it shows exactly that. Matter of fact, what a lot of people don't realize, in 1948, before the minimum wage started getting escalated, the unemployment rate among black teenagers was less than that among white teenagers, and their labor force participation was greater than white teenagers. And then just one final note, going back to South Africa. When I was in South Africa, I did my study on labor economics, and that's in the book, that South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And it turns out that white racist unions in South Africa were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for black people. And their stated reason was to make the wage high enough so that the employer would not hire black, but would hire a white instead. And I give many, many citations in the book of that being a justification. Now, in the United States, the justification is far more noble. It's to help low-skilled and black workers, but the effect is the same.
Sure. Well, I mean, you keep it in mind that if the intention in South Africa was one thing, and we see the effects here in the United States as being very similar, then it's demonstration of that admonition you had in 1984 in that video, and so many others. Milton Friedman was fond of saying, and I'm fond of saying it, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions indeed.
That's right.
So, Dr.
Right.
Will, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so the bottom line is that when we look at public policy, we should also always ask, what are the effects of public policy, not what are the intentions.
So just a few minutes left with our guest, John M. Olin, Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University, Dr. Walter E. Williams. And let's just go a little bit broader. We zeroed in on one policy, for example, minimum wage. But when you pose a question, how much can be blamed on discrimination in your book, Race and Economics? What's sort of your summation of that? How much can really be blamed on discrimination versus capitalism versus poor government policies like the minimum wage, for example, or lack of educational choice or government welfare programs?
Well, in today's America, very little can be blamed on discrimination, which is not the same as saying discrimination does not exist, but very little can be explained on it by discrimination. For example, the devastating illegitimacy rate among blacks, that's a devastating phenomena, but you cannot blame it on discrimination. Or if you look at the crime in black neighborhoods, where let's say in the case of Chicago, a person is shot every 3.5 hours and murdered every 17 or 18 hours. Well, and most often the victims are black, and it's not the Ku Klux Klan riding through the neighborhood doing that. If you look at the education in some schools, in many schools where that are predominantly black, the student body is predominantly black, the academic achievement is low. For example, in Baltimore, in the city of Baltimore, in 13 high schools, not a single student tests proficient in math, and only 5% tests proficient in reading. And Baltimore, its school system is the third highest spending jurisdiction in the country. They spend more per pupil than most other jurisdictions. So these cases that I mentioned, I'm sorry, they have nothing to do with discrimination.
I think it's so profound to think about that, and then also to think about the policies of the government that can be disincentives to work, that can be disincentives to hire, make it impossible sometimes to hire people, as we were talking about with regards to the minimum wage. It goes to the point that fundamentally the problem more than anything is government. Not the solution to the problem, Dr. Williams, but government is fundamentally the problem, is it not?
You're absolutely right.
Somebody should make a statement like that. Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. I don't know. Might make headlines, and people might be saying that for years to come. I just think it might be a good idea. So, Dr. Williams, let me ask you a question. We've just got a few minutes left here. Mark Cuban was on the show yesterday, and we had a spirited debate about his idea for a federal jobs program. One of the themes we've been talking about today with you and with our previous guests from the American Enterprise Institute is the important role that work plays in lifting people out of poverty. So someone might say that an idea like what Cuban is suggesting, which is hire 2 to 4 million people, kind of like what FDR did in the 1930s, to grease the skids of this economy, get things going again, that will also help lift people out of poverty because you're giving them jobs, you're giving them meaning and purpose in life. What about a government jobs program as opposed to, say, a welfare program, not just for the current pandemic, but also in general?
Well, I wouldn't even have a government jobs program. That is, what we need to do is for get government out of our lives.
Exactly. But
many, many, many more jobs.
Well, sure. But I'm curious your thoughts on the idea of a government jobs program. What would you contend is why we should not do something like that?
Well, we had it during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it did not do very much. Matter of fact, President Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, he said in 1939, Mr. President, we spent more money than we've ever spent, and all we got to show for it is debt and no improvement in the economy.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? That you spend all this money and then there's this revelation, hey, this didn't actually work. So, Dr. Williams, go ahead.
Well, see, the very point is you have to ask the question, where does the government get the money from? I mean, is it the Tooth Fairy or the Santa Claus giving the money? No. The only way the government can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate it from some other American. So if there's a government jobs program, yes, you'll see more people working at government jobs, but you have to say, well, what about over here? That is, a person's taxes have been increased in order for the government to have this program. And what happens to the number of jobs that would have been created if he hadn't been taxed in order to pay for the government jobs?
Dr. Walter E. Williams, I could talk with you for hours, sir. I always appreciate you joining us on this show, my radio programs, wherever. Thanks so much for taking the time on this special Free to Choose Friday to talk with us today.
And thank you, Jimmy, and good luck with your show.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Dr. Williams, and stay well and healthy. Once again, Dr. Walter E. Williams, Professor of Economics, John M. Olin, Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Always enjoy a good conversation with Professor Williams. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.